Picture this. It is the 47th day of the third cycle, year 318 of the Concord Accord, and you are sitting in the upper gallery of the Grand Concord Chamber aboard Havorin Wheel. The vote has just been called. 38 delegations in favor, 2 opposed, 1 abstention. The verdict is absolute. Earth has been stripped of sovereignty. Humanity has been placed under the protective guardianship of the Kelmery trade bloc. The 4 human delegates have been ordered to leave the chamber and surrender their authority within the hour. You have always been told that the humans accepted the ruling with quiet dignity, that they bowed their heads, gathered their papers, and walked out into the corridor where history would later remember them as honorable losers. That is the story carved into the diplomatic textbooks of 40 species. The true story of what happened inside that chamber reveals something far stranger. The humans did not leave. They did not weep. They did not protest. Ambassador Myra Castellan looked up at Speaker Orvin Drask from across the chamber floor, and she smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting 6 years for this exact moment. That smile is where the trouble began, and the trouble lasted 19 hours. Why would a delegation outnumbered nearly 20-1 refuse to leave a room? Why would they smile when every legal instrument in the galaxy had just been used to erase them? Before I tell you what really happened in that chamber, if you enjoy the buried histories of the Concord, the stories the official archives have tried to soften, please consider supporting this channel with a like and a subscription. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from. It still astonishes me that we are gathered across so many worlds, connected by our shared interest in the truths that powerful institutions would prefer to forget. What I am about to describe is not a battle. There were no weapons drawn, no ships fired, no blood spilled on the polished obsidian floor of the chamber. What happened on Havorin Wheel that day was something the Concord had no defense against, something it had never imagined possible. The galaxy's most consequential diplomatic disaster was not a war. It was a meeting that refused to end. To understand why 4 humans were able to hold an entire interstellar parliament hostage with nothing but a data slate and a copy of a founding document, you have to understand what the Concord Accord actually was. The Concord was not a government, it was a contract. 318 years before that vote, 11 founding species had signed a single agreement on a frozen moon called Havorin's Rest. That agreement, 11,000 pages of dense parliamentary law, established the rules by which all member species would coexist: trade, borders, conflict resolution, voting procedures, removal protocols. Every word had been negotiated by lawyers, clerks, and archivists, not by warriors, not by kings. By the year of the vote, the Concord had grown to 41 species spread across 9 territories. It had ruled longer than the Roman Empire, longer than the Ming Dynasty, longer than any human institution had ever survived. In those 3 centuries, the Concord had never once expelled a member. The humans had been members for only 22 years. They had joined late, signing the Reformed Accord during the Third Expansion Charter. Their entry had been controversial. They were loud. They were emotional. They asked too many questions. They missed protocol cues. They laughed at the wrong moments and apologized for the wrong things. The senior species considered them procedurally clumsy, a diplomatic embarrassment, a child species playing dress-up in adult robes. Step inside the gallery of the Grand Concord Chamber for a moment. The room is shaped like a perfect circle, 41 seats arranged in concentric rings descending toward a central speaking floor. The walls are made of black volcanic glass quarried from the founding moon. The ceiling is a slow-rotating projection of the galactic plane. The air is regulated to suit 14 different atmospheric tolerances simultaneously. Everything about the chamber is designed to communicate one message to anyone who enters it: you are small, we are ancient. Do not forget the difference. When the humans entered that chamber for the first time 22 years earlier, the older delegations watched them with quiet amusement. They expected the humans would learn to behave eventually. They expected wrong. The humans never quite learned, or so it seemed. The chamber underestimated them completely. That underestimation was about to cost the conquered everything. To understand the trap that closed around the council that day, you have to look at the man who built it. Speaker Orvin Drask of the Kelmery trade bloc was not a warrior. He had never held a weapon in his 300-year lifespan. He was something far more dangerous in a parliamentary system. He was patient. Drask was tall by Kelmery standards, with the pale silver coloration that marked the ruling caste of his species. He had risen through 40 years of trade arbitration before entering the council. He understood contracts the way a surgeon understands arteries. He knew exactly where to cut, exactly how much pressure to apply, and exactly when to wait for the patient to bleed out on his own. The Kelmery trade bloc had wanted humanity removed from the conquered for almost a decade. The official reason was humanity's destabilizing aggression. The unofficial reason was simpler. Humans were too efficient. They had moved into Kelmery trade routes within 10 years of joining the conquered, undercut Kelmery pricing on 17 commodities, and signed bilateral agreements with smaller species that bypassed the trade bloc entirely. They were not destabilizing the conquered. They were destabilizing Drask's monopoly. Consider the absurdity of his strategy. Drask did not build a fleet. He did not assassinate diplomats. He did not engineer a border incident. He sat in his office for 6 years and read voting records. He cataloged grievances. He identified which species owed which other species favors. He calculated with surgical precision exactly how many delegations he would need to flip to reach 38 votes. 38 was the magic number. 38 gave him the supermajority required under Standing Rule 9 to invoke a guardianship removal. He approached species one by one over the course of years. To the Telleran Republic, he offered trade concessions worth 800 million credits over a decade. To the Miravan Confederacy, he offered exclusive access to a contested asteroid belt. To the smaller delegations, he offered something even more valuable: protection. He warned them that humanity would eventually come for them too, that the only way to be safe was to remove humanity first. This was a hostile corporate takeover dressed in parliamentary robes, the medieval equivalent of buying out a board of directors one seat at a time until the founder of the company suddenly discovers he has been voted out of his own enterprise. Drask was not trying to defeat humanity in any conventional sense. He was trying to legally erase them. By the morning of the vote, Drask had counted his coalition 3 times: 38 firm votes, 2 opposed, 1 uncertain. The math was unbeatable. He arrived at the chamber that day calm, well-rested, and absolutely certain of victory. Every Kelmery analyst projected that the humans would react with anger and storm out, exactly as they had reacted to smaller procedural defeats in the past. The exit was scripted. The cameras were ready. Drask had prepared for every possible human reaction except one. He had not prepared for the possibility that the humans had read the contract more carefully than he had. Return now to the chamber on the day of the vote. The 4 human delegates sat together in the lower ring, their seats arranged in a tight square. Ambassador Myra Castellan in the front, Colonel Devon Ashby to her left, Sergeant Tomas Vega behind her, and Dr. Uni Park to her right. Park held a single black data slate on her lap. She had not looked up from it once during the 4 hours of debate. When Speaker Drask called the final vote, the chamber fell into the formal silence required by Standing Rule 7. Each delegation cast its vote in turn, beginning with the founding species and descending through seniority. The Kelmery voted in favor of removal. The Miravan voted in favor. The Drenic, the Volusian, the Cathari, the Ohm, the Pashuran all voted in favor. When the call reached the Telleran Republic, humanity's only true ally on the council, Councillor Irsa Vone raised her translucent green hand and abstained. There was a small intake of breath from the gallery. Vone had been expected to vote against removal. Her abstention was the final piece of Drask's coalition. It pushed his count past 38 without forcing him to use his backup votes. It was elegant. It was lethal. The final tally was read aloud: 38 in favor, 2 opposed, 1 abstention. Speaker Drask rose from his seat and addressed the chamber. He spoke for less than a minute. He thanked the delegations for their wisdom. He instructed the human delegation to vacate the chamber within the hour and to transmit their surrender of sovereignty to the central registry before the start of the next cycle. He gestured toward the great doors at the chamber's eastern arc. The humans were supposed to weep. They were supposed to shout. They were supposed to gather their materials and walk out into the corridor where the recording teams were waiting to capture their humiliation. That was the script. That was what every delegation expected. Instead, Ambassador Myra Castellan slowly stood up. She adjusted the collar of her dark gray jacket. She smiled at Speaker Drask across the chamber. And then she spoke 6 words that none of us in the gallery understood at the time. "Speaker, I invoke Standing Rule 14. A confused murmur ran through the chamber. Standing Rule 14 had not been invoked in living memory. Most of the delegates had never even heard of it. It was a procedural courtesy clause from the original accord, allowing any member to request the floor for a closing statement before the enforcement of any vote. Drask hesitated. The rule was real. It was technically valid. He could refuse, but a refusal would set an awkward precedent. He glanced at his procedural advisor, who nodded once. Drask waved his hand dismissively. He granted Castellan the floor. He expected a brief, emotional speech of protest, something the cameras could use as a final humiliation. Castellan thanked him. She walked down to the central speaking floor. She placed her hands on the obsidian podium, and she began to speak. 19 hours later, she would still be speaking. Or rather, she and her 3 colleagues, rotating in carefully timed shifts, would still be holding the floor. The chamber did not know it yet, but the humans had not come to lose the vote. They had come to detonate it. To understand what was about to happen, you need to understand what Dr. Uni Park had been doing for the previous 2 years. Park was 41 years old, quiet, and almost unknown outside of the Terran diplomatic corps. She had 2 doctorates, one in comparative xenolaw, one in pre-conquered constitutional history. She had been assigned to the Havorin delegation 18 months before the vote, ostensibly as a legal advisor. Her actual job was something the Earth Council had never assigned anyone before. Park had been ordered to read the Concord Accord. The entire thing, all 11,000 pages, word by word, footnote by footnote, appendix by appendix. Think about the scale of that task for a moment. The Accord was written in 3 languages, 2 of which were extinct. It contained 4,712 standing rules, 1,038 procedural clauses, 209 appendices, and a frankly absurd number of footnotes referencing other footnotes. Most working delegates relied on summaries. Even the senior species kept only a handful of specialists who knew the document well, and even those specialists focused on the sections relevant to their portfolios. Nobody had read the entire Accord cover to cover in at least 80 years. Park read it twice. Then she read it again. She made annotations. She built cross-references. She identified contradictions, dead clauses, and forgotten precedents. By the time she boarded the shuttle to Havorin Wheel, she had compiled a 340-page private brief titled simply Vulnerabilities of the Accord. The brief had been read by exactly 4 people: Castellan, Ashby, Vega herself. The brief identified 73 procedural weapons buried in the Accord that nobody else on the Council was using. Some were minor. Some were catastrophic. The most catastrophic of all was hidden in Appendix C, Section 4, Clause 11. It was a clause so old, so deeply buried, that the modern indexing system had stopped referencing it 3 revisions ago. The clause was called the right of founding petition. The humans had not come to Havorin Wheel to plead for mercy. They had come to fight a procedural war the Council did not even know was possible. Castellan was the face. Ashby was the voice. Vega was the steady presence. Park was the architect. When Castellan walked down to the speaking floor and placed her hands on the podium, the trap closed. The humans had been waiting 6 years for Drask to call this vote. He had not been hunting them. They had been hunting him. They had needed him to reach 38 votes. They had needed the supermajority to be invoked, because only a supermajority removal triggered the procedural pathway that allowed them to use what Park had found. Ambassador Castellan began with a polite, almost apologetic acknowledgement of the Council's decision. She spoke slowly. She thanked Speaker Drask for his service. She thanked the delegations for their attention. She referenced 4 obscure precedents from rulings 200 years old. Then she filed her first procedural motion, a request for clarification on the voting record. It was 9 in the morning, station time, when she filed that motion. By midnight, the chamber would understand that they had walked into something none of them had ever seen before. The first 3 hours unfolded in a way that the chamber initially mistook for desperation. Castellan filed motions. Ashby seconded them. Park whispered constantly into Castellan's earpiece. Each motion was small. Each motion was technical. Each motion required the council to formally respond before the original vote could be enforced. Motion 1. Request for clarification of voting record. Granted, processed in 12 minutes. Motion 2. Challenge to the procedural standing of the Miravan vote, citing a 217-year-old precedent in which a delegate had voted while in technical violation of their own credentialing rules. Granted hearing, processed in 41 minutes. Motion 3. Request for formal review of the Kelmery Coalition Agreement's understanding Rule 88. Granted hearing, processed in over an hour. Drask leaned forward in his seat. His silver coloration had darkened slightly. He had expected one closing speech. He had not expected 11 motions in 3 hours. He gestured to his procedural advisor again. The advisor looked uncomfortable. By hour 5, the chamber began to realize something was wrong. The humans were not slowing down. They were not running out of motions. They were not making emotional appeals. They were citing rules, rules from the founding documents, rules nobody in the chamber had ever heard before. Colonel Devon Ashby took the floor for the first time at hour 4 and began reading aloud from a section of the accord that referenced procedural delays during contested removal votes. He read for 47 minutes. He cited 11 different subclauses. Each citation forced the speaker to acknowledge the motion before proceeding. Step into the chamber at hour 6 for a moment. The lights have not changed. The atmospheric regulators have continued their soft hum. The delegates are still in their seats, but they are no longer relaxed. The Miravan delegation has begun to whisper among themselves. The Volusian envoy has called for a recess and been refused understanding Rule 14, which Castellan invoked at the start. The recess cannot be granted while a closing statement is in progress. Castellan and her colleagues have been speaking, in carefully timed rotation, for 6 straight hours. The closing statement, technically, has not yet ended. This was a parliamentary siege, the medieval equivalent of finding a single typo in a merger document that voids the entire acquisition, except the humans were finding the typo every 15 minutes, on a different page, in a different language. Park's data slate scrolled constantly. Every time the council attempted to enforce the vote, she identified another procedural objection. The council could not enforce the ruling while objections were on the floor. The objections never stopped. At hour 7, the humans did something the chamber had never seen before. They began to sleep in shifts. I watched this from the upper gallery with my own eyes. Sergeant Tomas Vega laid down on the floor behind the human delegation seats. He placed his jacket over his eyes. He slept for exactly 90 minutes. When he rose, Ashby took his place. They had brought field rations. They had brought water. They had brought a small thermal blanket. They had come prepared to live in the chamber for as long as the chamber refused to acknowledge the truth. The other delegates had not. The Miravan delegation began to grow visibly tired. The Volusian envoy left the chamber for a meal and was technically still permitted to return, but each departure weakened the coalition's symbolic unity. By hour 9, 3 delegations had asked permission to send substitute delegates. Each substitute had to be sworn in understanding Rule 22, which Park had ready citations for. Each swearing in took 20 minutes. Speaker Drask had not slept. He had not eaten. He could not leave the chamber because leaving would technically end his role as presiding officer during the closing statement. He sat in his elevated chair, his silver skin growing visibly grayer, and watched 4 humans calmly dismantle 6 years of his work. He still believed he could win. He had 38 votes. The vote was already cast. He only needed to outlast the humans until they collapsed. He did not yet understand that the humans had not come to outlast him. They had come to make the vote irrelevant. At hour 11, the humans lost their only friend. Councillor Yrsa Vone of the Tellurin Republic rose from her seat and requested the floor for a procedural statement. Castellan, who was speaking at the time, paused and granted her the courtesy. Vone was a small, slender figure with translucent green skin and a quiet voice. She had been Castellan's closest ally on the council for 9 years. They had shared meals. They had celebrated each other's children. Vone had once stood on the floor of the Concord and defended humanity's right to membership during a contentious review. She did not look at Castellan when she spoke. She announced that the Tellurin Republic could no longer participate in the procedural delay. She asked the speaker to record her formal withdrawal of objection to the original vote. She thanked the chamber for its patience. She sat down. The Kelmery trade concessions had reached her 3 days earlier. 800 million credits over a decade, exclusive shipping rights on 2 minor routes, and a guarantee of priority access to Kelmery medical technology. The Tellurin Republic was a small species. Their elder population was suffering. The medical technology alone would extend 2 generations of lives. Vone had wept when she signed the agreement. She had told her staff she had no choice. I was watching Castellan when Vone finished speaking. Castellan did not react. She did not turn her head. She did not change her expression. She continued speaking on her current motion as though Vone had never spoken. Park, however, leaned forward. She whispered something into Castellan's earpiece. I could not hear it from the gallery. I have spent decades wondering what she said. Decades later, in retirement, I asked one of the humans involved. He told me what Park had said, and I have never forgotten it. Park had whispered, "We do not need her. We never needed her. Continue." The humans had built their plan with the assumption that they would have no allies. Every contingency Park had prepared assumed 38 to 40 hostile votes. Vone's abstention had been a courtesy, not a necessity. Her betrayal cost the humans nothing, because the humans had never been counting on her. This was the moment the chamber should have understood what was happening. A delegation that does not flinch when its only ally betrays it is not a delegation that is desperate. It is a delegation that knows something the rest of the room does not. Drask noticed. His advisor noticed. The advisor whispered something urgent in his ear. Drask waved him off. He still had the math. He still had 38 votes. He could still outlast them. He was wrong. He had been wrong for 11 hours. At hour 15, Speaker Drask made his fatal mistake. He had been operating on 3 hours of sleep across 2 days. His advisor had stepped out for a medical break. The procedural delays from the humans had begun to feel like background noise. He believed the humans were exhausting their motions. He believed the end was close. He decided to force a final ruling. He rose from his chair and announced that, understanding Rule 9, the original vote would now be enforced regardless of further procedural delays. He instructed the chamber stewards to begin the formal eviction protocol against the Terran delegation. He instructed the Central Registry to record humanity's loss of sovereignty as effective immediately. It was a procedural error, a small one. Understanding Rule 14, which Castellan had invoked at the start, The closing statement of a member could not be terminated by the presiding officer except through a unanimous chamber vote. Drask had skipped that step. He had assumed it was a formality. He had been awake too long. Castellan was waiting for it. She rose to her feet. She did not raise her voice. She walked back to the central speaking floor. She placed her hands on the podium, and she spoke 14 words that none of us in the gallery would ever forget. Speaker Drask, under Appendix C, Section 4, Clause 11, I invoke the right of founding petition. The chamber went silent, the kind of silence that does not occur in a parliamentary body, the kind of silence that occurs in a courtroom when a verdict has been read in a language nobody recognizes. Delegates turned to their procedural advisors. Advisors began frantically searching their data slates. Most could not find the clause. The clause had been removed from the modern indexing system. It existed only in the original founding text. Speaker Drask stared at her. He did not speak. His advisor had not returned. He did not know what the right of founding petition was. He gestured to the chamber archivist, who was me, and asked me to retrieve the founding text from the secure archive. I rose from my seat in the upper gallery. I walked down the spiral staircase to the chamber floor. I crossed the obsidian floor in front of 41 delegations, all of them watching me, none of them speaking. I entered the archive vault. I retrieved the original founding text of the Concord Accord. It was a heavy, bound volume sealed in protective glass. It had not been opened in 70 years. I carried it back into the chamber. I placed it on the speaker's podium. I unsealed the protective glass. I opened the volume to Appendix C, Section 4, Clause 11, and I read aloud. The clause was short. It was written in the original founding language, which I, as a senior archivist, was trained to read. I translated it into the chamber's working language as I read. Removal of any member species from the Concord shall require unanimous consent of all founding signatories and all subsequent signatories of the Reformed Accord, regardless of standing rule supermajorities. No vote of removal shall be valid without such unanimous consent. Any attempt to enforce a removal vote without unanimous consent shall be procedurally void and shall trigger the protective elevation of the targeted member to permanent founding status. I closed the book. The chamber did not move, not one delegate, not one staff member, not one advisor. The atmospheric regulators continued their soft hum. The galactic plane continued to rotate slowly across the ceiling. 41 delegations sat in absolute silence and tried to understand what they had just heard. Ambassador Myra Castellan, still standing at the podium, smiled again. It was the same smile she had given when the vote was first announced 15 hours earlier. Speaker Drask, she said softly, the vote against humanity required unanimous consent of all signatories. The Tellurin abstention, even after her withdrawal, did not constitute consent. The vote is procedurally void, and under the second half of the clause that the senior archivist just read, humanity is now elevated to permanent founding status. The chamber erupted. What followed in the next 3 hours was the most desperate procedural counterattack in the history of the Concord. Speaker Drask filed 12 emergency motions in 80 minutes. Each one was an attempt to invalidate the right of founding petition. Each one failed. He challenged the authenticity of the founding text. Park produced verification protocols. Motion denied. He claimed the clause had been superseded by later amendments. Ashby produced the amendment history. The clause had never been amended. Motion denied. He argued that the humans, having joined under the Reformed Accord rather than the original Accord, did not qualify as signatories under the clause. Park produced the original Reformed Accord, which explicitly stated that all Reformed Accord signatories possessed equivalent procedural rights to original signatories. Motion denied. He attempted to convene an emergency procedural council to override the clause. Castellan invoked Standing Rule 207, which required a 40-day notice period for any emergency procedural counsel. Motion denied. Park had spent 2 years anticipating every possible countermotion. She had prepared rebuttals for 68 specific legal challenges. Drask used 12 of them. None of them worked. The humans were not just winning. They were demonstrating in front of the entire council that they had read the rulebook better than the people who wrote it. Drask's silver coloration was now almost gray. His advisor had returned and was visibly arguing with him in low tones. The advisor was telling him to stop. Every failed motion was making the situation worse. Every failed motion was adding to the procedural record that humanity had been unjustly targeted. The humans had not come to survive the vote. They had come to win the next 300 years of votes. At hour 18, Drask did something no Kelmery official had ever done in the history of the Concord. He sat down. He stopped filing motions. He simply sat. Castellan returned to the speaking floor one final time. She did not gloat. She did not celebrate. She thanked the chamber for its attention. She formally requested that the council ratify, under the second half of the founding petition clause, humanity's elevation to permanent founding status. The motion required a simple majority. It passed 39-2. Even the Kelmery voted in favor because under the clause, refusal to ratify would have triggered further procedural penalties. It was the most humiliating vote in the history of the Concord. 39 delegations, including the Kelmery themselves, voting to give humanity exactly the thing they had spent 6 years trying to take away. At hour 19, the chamber adjourned. The humans gathered their materials calmly. Sergeant Vega folded the thermal blanket. Colonel Ashby closed his briefcase. Dr. Unipark, who had not spoken a single word on the chamber floor in 19 hours, finally closed her data slate. Ambassador Myra Castellan shook hands with the chamber stewards. The 4 of them walked out through the eastern doors, the same doors they had been ordered to walk through 19 hours earlier in defeat. They walked out as the most powerful delegation in the Concord. Speaker Orvin Drask resigned within 14 months. The Kelmery trade bloc lost 3 of its allied delegations within the same period, each species recalculating its political alignments after watching what had happened in the chamber. Councillor Irsa Vone lost her seat in the next Tellerin election, 3 years after the vote. Her opponent ran a single campaign slogan. She abstained. It was enough. Earth's permanent founding veto fundamentally restructured the Concord. Every major ruling for the next 300 years required Earth's consent. Humanity, the species that had been called procedurally clumsy, became the procedural anchor of the entire interstellar government. The Kelmery never recovered their pre-vote influence. The smaller species that had voted for removal, fearing humanity's revenge, instead found that the humans showed no interest in revenge at all. The humans simply attended every meeting, voted carefully, and read every document. Drask had tried to weaponize parliamentary procedure to erase a species. He had instead taught that species how to use the same weapon against everyone else. By attempting to remove humanity, the Conquered had inadvertently made humanity permanent. This is the moral that the official archives have softened. Power does not always come from force. Sometimes the deadliest weapon in the room is the one nobody has bothered to read. The species that takes the rules seriously, even when no one else does, becomes the species that rewrites them. Drask had assumed the humans would react with emotion, because every previous interaction had suggested they were emotional. He had not understood that humans, when sufficiently threatened, become the most procedurally disciplined species in the galaxy. They had not been clumsy. They had been waiting. I retired from the senior archivist's office 18 years after the vote. I returned to my home territory. I built a small library in my private residence. I obtained a personal copy of the Concord Accord, all 11,000 pages, and I have been reading it cover to cover ever since. I am on my 3rd complete reading. I have found 41 clauses so far that I had never noticed in my 40-year career. Some of them are minor. Some of them are not. I think often about what Dr. Uni Park whispered to Ambassador Castellan when the Telerin Republic abandoned them. We do not need her. We never needed her. Continue. I think about what it took to build a plan that did not require allies. I think about how long the humans must have been preparing in silence, watching the Council underestimate them year after year, knowing the day would come when they would finally be invited to lose. I think about how that day must have felt for them. To sit in a chamber that believed it had defeated them, holding the only weapon that mattered, and to smile. The humans lost the vote. They lost their only ally. They lost 3 days of their lives to a procedural siege in a hostile chamber, and in losing, they secured their species' future for 300 years. Thank you for joining me on this account of what really happened on Havorin Wheel that day. If this story changed how you understand the Conquered, please consider supporting the channel with a like and a subscription. Which forgotten council, which buried treaty, which silent diplomatic victory should we examine next? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you in the next account.